about graduation. So, graduation is in the UK the system whereby there is a specific piece in each book. In the first 3 books they are Gosset Gavotte, Beethoven Minuet and Trio, and Bach Bourrée, but it's not always towards the end of the book. And the process is that once you finish that book, you should have been playing that piece for 3 months, so it's definitely into review. And the child makes 1 recording with a backing track or live accompanist, and it's not supposed to be edited at all, and you're supposed to have basically a very high quality performance of that piece. Some teachers do twinkle graduations or allegro graduations within their own studios as well, which I think is a very nice thing to do, but I haven't managed to organise myself to do it. And so the process is you make a recording, and that's what we're going to talk about how to do. Make a recording of the piece, and then that recording goes to an auditor, which is, I think, so far anyway, has been level 5 qualified teachers in that country. The auditor will listen to the recording and write a report, but it's a no-fail system, which means that the teacher decides whether it's good enough to graduate. So if you, as the teacher, if you say, I'm sending this recording in, it is good enough, then unless it's like so far away from the expectation of the BSMA that they send it back and say, no, this shouldn't have graduated, which happens very infrequently. Arguably, possibly there should be some more examples of that happening, but anyway. So once you and the student decide together it's good enough to graduate, then you submit it, but the submitting is not to find out if it is good enough, it is to get a report from someone who doesn't know the child that says, I really loved your legato, you've got beautiful tone, now keep working on your intonation, you know, a good way to practice bar 53 is blah blah blah, keep up the good work, congratulations. And then when that's all happened, you get a certificate, you get the report from the teacher, and the child, in most cases, will be invited to play in a concert that will be all of the kids at that level graduating, playing that piece. And in most cases, the graduation concerts are a play down. So if you're graduating level 5, you would play 5, 4, 3, 2, and 1. So this is a reason that all the graduation pieces are always in your continuous review list.
When you say 5, 4, 3, 2, 1, you mean the pieces?
Book 5, Book 4, Book 3, Book 2.
What are the pieces for Book 4?
Book 4, Vivaldi A minor first movement.
Oh, okay.
But certainly for me, I have a very hard and fast rule. You do not graduate the book until you've finished it, even though the piece, you know, you could have a student who's on Bach double, because the piece is in the middle of the book.
Sorry, Vivaldi A minor first or third?
Book 5 is the G minor slow movement, so that's actually only the 4th piece in the book. And then book 6 is La Folia, which is the first piece in the book. So I think you just need to make sure as you set up your studios that you are not setting the children and their parents up to expect that as soon as they've been doing that piece for 3 months they can graduate, but that they finish the book and also they've been doing it for at least 3 months.
Yeah.
Because also you don't want a child who's on Judas Maccabeus who finished Gossip a week before to be like, oh, graduation deadline's in 2 weeks, can we do my recording? Like, no, you've only just learnt it. It's not going to be in review, it's not going to be a performance level recording if you do that. They pay something like £27, I think, in order to go through that process, which is centrally administrated through the BSMA. And they must be members of the BSMA in order to do that. At the Hub we have certificates that you can come and get for finishing a book, which is very definitely not graduation, it is finishing the book. And that's just to recognise that they've finished the book, they've got the credit for the last piece. And then, you know, maybe another year or even 2 years before they graduate at that level. Some teachers, I know Helen Brunner makes all of her kids wait until they're book 4 before they do graduation. So you hear Gossett Gavottes with vibrato and, you know, very, very high level. For me, I want to start it a bit earlier, but it's up to you.
So if they're like book 4 and they're graduating for book 1, what about the other books? I mean, do they just...
So you can't miss out any books, but you can do multiple levels at once. So if they did book 4, you could do levels 1, 2 and 3, or you could say you always go back 4 levels, so they won't do book 4 until they're in book 8.
Okay.
It's up to you where you draw the line, really. And you know, it's very much to do with the child's personality as well and how they feel about that process. It's a very different thing to try and get a really good recording in one take than it is to, you know, do a performance that you're happy with, or you know, play a piece for a solo or whatever. I think, so for example, some of my students are, one of my students is on Bach double, book 4, and she is going to graduate book 3 this year because she really doesn't feel confident about the whole process. I don't make all my students do it. Most of them do it because it's a kind of standard expectation, but certainly with the later teenagers, I'll be saying to them, look, if you don't want to spend all this time doing a piece that you learnt a year ago and making a recording, you know, getting Vivaldi A minor up to scratch for a recording it's supposed to be at the recording tempo, like the CD tempo. That's a big amount of work. And if you're talking about, you know, a 15-year-old who's getting ready for GCSEs, who's practicing maybe 3 times a week still, coming to the hub for group, playing in orchestra, maybe playing in Chineke or NYO or something else like that as well, you know, they may just feel like, actually, in terms of the 2 hours a week I've got to actually practice by myself, this is not a reasonable use of my time. And for me, I'm like, that's completely fine. Whereas books 1 to 3, nearly all my students do it eventually, even if they do it like a whole year after they could have.
So getting the certificate for getting to the end of the book is different from graduation.
Yeah, and that's just a hub thing. I literally just designed them myself and got them printed.
So I have to double check, because Claude was saying she wanted to do graduation for book 4. I said, no, you haven't finished book 4 yet.
Yeah. But as soon as he finishes Bach double, he can get the certificate.
But I asked if he'd done graduation for book 3, and she said yes. And I'm thinking...
But you were teaching him then, weren't you?
No.
Who was teaching him then?
Why?
That was ages ago though.
Yeah.
But you wouldn't be able to do graduation for book 4 until you're... book 3 until you're into book 4.
Yeah, and I know I didn't do it.
What piece did you take him on at? Do you remember?
I think it was in the A minor.
Oh, so
we
maybe he did.
We went back a bit and we did the sights and stuff because he was...
So you should ask Nicky Chapman.
Okay.
Or Jorge. You may remember.
I think I
Yeah,
remember
remember.
saying that. Thank you.
So, thoughts about the process of actually recording. I think in terms of communicating with the students, it's really important to communicate to them that every recording they ever hear, unless it's a live performance, has been very, very highly edited. And you know, if you are a performer who does recordings, you can say things to them like, when I did a, you know, music recording of X, Y, and Z, we spent 10 hours getting 3-minute pieces together. I mean, that's pretty standard. Like, to do a 3-hour session on one pop song, and they'll loop every chorus, so you're actually maybe recording 2 minutes of actual music in 3 hours is very industry standard. In fact, by some people it would be considered to be extremely slapdash. You know, if you have a recording session with an orchestra, well, Mimi, you probably did loads of them. What would be the standard expectation for performing, like for recording a whole symphony?
Well, you know, it really depends on the conductor.
Okay.
It really does. Some, the best will want to do one complete take, but I mean, Karamazur, he would only do complete takes, so you'd play Brahms 1 3 times.
Mm-hmm.
But if you might have another one, I don't know, I can think of several who would want to go bar by bar, get really picky, and when it comes to recording concertos, again, it depends on the soloist.
Yeah.
You know, you get there are some soloists that do need to do it bar by bar, and it's just stitched together, and others won't do that. It depends really on the artist and the producer. And it's really variable, but I've got very, very cynical about recordings. And if I'm buying a recording tell you now, even live ones are not often live. I mean,
Yeah.
for instance, this is something you probably don't know, but London orchestras now, they will record. They'll say we're recording this as a live concert, but it's almost never. Firstly, they will record the rehearsal in the afternoon or in the morning. So that's recorded. That's a backup recording.
Yeah.
So they've got that covered. And then they do often, and this has happened in the last sort of few years that I was working full time doing it. They have what they call a patching session. So again, they would have you play the concert, and then wait for the audience to go, and then they would call the orchestra back onto the stage.
The same night?
After the concert, yeah.
Oh my God.
Yeah, and so you'd have to go over bits which didn't go right, so you'd be there for another, I think it was, they're allowed to keep you for an extra half an hour after the concert for a catching session. So it's almost nothing is completely untampered with now.
Well, the only thing that you can really rely on is a live broadcast, isn't it? Which is literally you are seeing and listening to what you would see and listen to in the
It's
concert.
so, it's really, I find it quite depressing.
Yeah.
I mean, it's because it gives such a deceptive level of what perfection sounds like.
Absolutely. And this is what the students, especially those students who are like teenagers who are thinking of taking it really seriously, very often will be extremely perfectionist personalities and give themselves a really hard time about not being perfect. And they've got to understand how manufactured it is. Because, every pop song, all of it is just, that's not it. And, in some ways I think the Suzuki thing of like making a one-take recording, you kind of think, well, why? But I guess they don't want people to be patching together bar by bar, Gothic of art. And let's face it, most of us don't have the skills to do that anyway.
Are they allowed to take more than one take though? So it's a complete take, unedited, but they're allowed to say they could do 4 complete takes.
Exactly. So this is exactly what we're going to talk about now.
Yeah.
I recommend. So the deadline has always been in July, and now they've suddenly, the first year after COVID, put it back to the 3rd of June, which I think is really unhelpful. Anyway, I would recommend that if you have students that are like in the middle of a book, so they're going to want to record the book before's graduation piece, that you say to them that you'll do it in the second half of the spring term, so like February, March time. And that means that then you've got 6 weeks or 7 weeks of overlap before you get to the actual deadline. I don't think the deadline is a massive hard and fast rule. I'm just going to see if this is still recording. Yes, 13 minutes, good. And so what I do with my students, and I think it is really helpful for them to know where they are in the plan of, like, this is how we approach having to make a really good recording like this, is that, so let's say after February half term, you'll say, right, graduation deadline is June. Would you like to graduate this year, or do you want to leave it? And for some kids that will be their choice, and other kids it will be like, we're not even going to talk about it because it's too early, and other kids it will be like, they don't want to do it, so therefore you leave it. But if you've got a student who's at the right point who wants to do it, you say, okay, so now we're going to start polishing this piece up. We're not going to record it, but we're going to work on it every week. We'll spend maybe 5 minutes. So if you're talking about one of the early books, well, all of them really, I would maybe work on the first half. Gothic, maybe work on the first 2 lines and then do 2 lines each week. Like, give yourself a really long run up at it, so that what doesn't happen is you just grind to a halt on everything that's not graduation, because otherwise that can cause problems elsewhere, obviously. So review it as if it were a solo, basically. It's a good opportunity to do it as a solo if you've got, all the kids here will be doing something in group. If you've got students elsewhere, they can play it to a neighbour or, make a video for grandparents or whatever. And then once they can play it to you really well by themselves, you introduce the backing track or play the piano with them. And at that point, you can say, okay, we're going to make at least 4 recordings of this over the next 4 weeks. What we're going to do is we're going to record it without thinking that it's going to be perfect. We're going to listen back to it together. We're going to talk about what you liked, what you're proud of, and what you would like to change. So you put the power with the student, and you're not listening to it going, oh, that doesn't sound right. You're listening, helping them to identify what they want to change. So you make a recording, and then you would listen back to it, watching the music, so they might put, you know, a post-it note or something where there's a problem. Or it might be generally, I would like to work on my intonation better, or the sound isn't great, whatever it is, and then you teach them accordingly, you know, how to make that better. And then the next week you would say, okay, let's make another recording, the same process, and then by the time they are feeling like, okay, I think that's really good, there's nothing else that I'm dissatisfied with, you can say, okay, so let's make a recording, and if it doesn't go perfectly, that doesn't matter, we'll do it again next week. But what you want to do is basically spend 5 to 10 minutes of each lesson from the start to the finish of the process, rather than try and like block out 3 weeks where you spend all of the lesson doing it, because otherwise everything else just gets impacted. The higher up the books you go, the more difficult that is to do, because, you know, it's tricky to carve up the pieces and it takes longer to play it all through and but also by that point they can also spend, like, they're able to keep their learning in other areas going more independently, so it's not such a problem if you don't teach them the preview for the next piece, or if you don't do sight reading or the group pieces with them or whatever.
And this is an audio recording, not video?
It is audio, it cannot be video.
What is that then? What do they do?
I think it's slightly, I would say, misguided attempt at equal opportunities.
Oh, I see, yeah.
I mean, I think it's frustrating because I've had some students with really not great technique, and, you know, mostly, yes, you can hear it and you can say, try and relax your elbow more, or how's your posture, it sounds like you might be uncomfortable when you play. But, you know, a lot of feedback for how we play is about how we look while we're playing, isn't it? Like,
yeah, I mean, I was going to say that's one of the good, I've always thought one of the real benefits of the Suzuki method as opposed to this sort of normal ABRSM route, is because good posture and good bow holds is rewarded. You know, you get you know, you get extra points for that.
Yeah,
Whereas
exactly.
in an ABRSM exam, it's done
ABRSM.
yeah, whatever it is.
Yeah.
It's just done orally.
Yeah.
And it doesn't matter how you can have a kid.
Well, most of the
really
time
well
you
set
don't even
up.
know the examiner won't even know what a good bow hold looks
Well,
like.
no, exactly.
With a bad bow hold, so we're organists.
Exactly, that's what I mean. And the fact that it's the graduation things are marked by a string specialist.
Well, someone, yeah,
Already
for Suzuki graduation, someone who plays your instrument. It's not even a string specialist like Trinity.
But I'm surprised that things like
I know, I think it's a shame, and I also think the problem with it is that if you've got a kid on a bad instrument, it can sound exactly the same as a child on a really good instrument playing with a very wonky bow, or like way too much weight or not enough weight. You know, like a £100 violin and a £5,000 violin played really badly, a £100 violin played really well, that you're not going to be able to really assess what you're getting. But having said that, the assessors are extremely, you know, highly qualified and experienced teachers, and most of it is not on that kind of level. Most of it will be, you can hear if there's a problem.
I suppose, I mean, there are pros to doing anything for them.
Yeah.
And there was that whole thing of, if I'm right believing that Dr. Suzuki said that he could hear, just by hearing, he could know what was good technique and not what was bad technique and going on. So it's in the history of Suzuki and in that being a way of assessing.
Yeah. And the history is that when Suzuki first started, Dr. Suzuki would listen to all of the recordings from everyone in Japan and make a cassette recording of his feedback back to them.
One of my students' parents still has his.
Yeah.
And he showed me some pictures of him with Dr. Suzuki on stage, and his little short pants and stuff. And he said, no, he's still got his audio. I was like, you should be teaching this child.
And the other part of it that's very easy to forget and ignore is that they have to make an announcement. I find it frustrating that we have on the one hand the equal opportunities of not seeing the video, and on the other hand they have to announce their age. How is it helpful to know whether it's a 13-year-old or a 5-year-old recording Gossett Gavotte? I think it's wrong. anyway. So as it goes, at the moment they have to say, my name is Kate Conway, I am 43 years old and I would like to play Gavotte by Gossec. And for a lot of children that is very difficult, and I really, really highly recommend that as soon as you're starting to make a recording, even when you're saying, I don't even care if you make a mistake, let's just practice making a recording start to finish, get used to the feeling of this being on the spot, is that you get them to do the announcements really early on, so they've done it a million times by the time they actually make the recording. And I think you do need to teach them to speak loudly and slowly. And for my students, I say it's like you definitely need to take 3 breaths, even though you can do it all in 1 breath. You need to say, my name is Kate Conway, I am 43 years old, and I would like to play Gavotte by Gossec. Because when you're in a performance situation and you're telling a whole hall full of people what you're going to play, they don't know who you are, they're not expecting, and they don't know anything from you, and it really, the audience's brain needs the time that you're breathing in between each bit of information to take it in. Whereas if you go, my name is Kate Conway, I'm 43 years old and I'm going to play Gavotte by Gossec, even though it's loud and fairly slow, it's just too jumbled together. So I would recommend that you also teach them very carefully how to do the announcement. And often auditors will write, I really liked your announcement, or I couldn't really hear your announcement, could you make it loud next time?
An interesting thing when you're talking about doing recordings and assessing the recordings to work on the next week and doing recording each week. Just point of interest for me, do you ever experiment with distancing yourself from the recording and not assessing it until a week later?
I haven't ever done that, no.
Right. Okay.
What would you set as practice in between?
Well, it's just for the understanding of how to assess what you're assessing. Are you assessing when it's your own playing, your own recording and stuff? Are you it's like people who don't like the sound of their own voice. Mm-hmm. You don't want to hear it recorded and you hear back, that's not what I was trying to sound like. And when you listen to your recording, what you're playing is, I was trying to achieve this is what I was physically thinking of doing. So your listening is tempered by your memory of what you're physically trying to do at that time. So you're not hearing what you would hear with that temperance of your angst over what's just occurred.
I think with all due respect, darling, the level of what the kids are listening to is very much more basic than that. Most of them have never listened to themselves and thought, is that in tune or out of tune? And they're just thinking,
but that's, I mean,
does it sound like I expected it to sound?
So, but I'm not. I'm trying to voice something which sounds complicated, but it's not that complicated. If you're not used to listening to yourself, when you listen to yourself back for the first time, you have an emotional response to it. And I think kids will have that emotional response as well.
Yeah, no, I definitely agree with that.
And it's about trying to distance themselves from the emotional response, because the emotional response is sometimes brought by the fact it's such an immediate thing from what they've just done. So separating that moment, the recorded moment, from the listening moment from the recorded moment, is something to create a better understanding of listening to what they do and how they do it. And I'm saying it's an interesting point for me, because I think it is, having done lots of self-tape auditions, having done lots of all sorts of things, it is amazing what you hated, and then you come back to a week later, you go, oh, I tell you what, I quite like that. And there is a huge emotional response to what you've tried to put down, and whether kids have you, like, and this is why I'm asking teachers who experience, is there, in assessing a recording, is that something you've looked into? Is there an emotional response to what
It's not something I've looked into. There's definitely an emotional response, absolutely. It's a difficult thing to do. I don't really feel like waiting a week would help them find it less difficult, because I think the disconnect is that if they're not really listening to what they're doing, they expect something different to come out on the recording than what does. Whereas I think what you're saying is that because we're quite perfectionists, when you record something you think, oh, that was awful, and then when you listen back to it a week later you think, oh no, that was fine. But what you're talking about is a tiny nuance of whether something is awful or not, whereas what the kids are listening for is actually, did you hit a C sharp or was it just a C natural? Do you know what I mean? But I mean, it's definitely worth investigating. I will try it with my students. Thank you.
There's another thing to bear in mind. Part of the reason when you listen to yourself or recording to yourself, it doesn't sound the way you think it does in your head. Same with your speech when you're speaking, is because of bone induction. We don't hear in that sort of way. So when you're playing, because your instrument is contacting your skeleton, it sounds more resonant to you inside your head. But when you hear a recording, it's not going to quite have that resonance. So maybe just to warn the child that actually,
definitely,
it's probably going to sound a little bit different than you expect.
Definitely, and do use a Bluetooth speaker. Don't say let's do a recording and then listen back to it on the phone, because even though phones are much better than they used to be, it's not going to sound as good as it will through a speaker. And you know, the child and the parent might be sitting there thinking, oh god, that sounds really grim. And if you've just recorded on a, you know, crappy old phone, then that is going to be a lot to do with the actual playing back of the phone, not the, like most phones, the microphone is actually better than the speaker, because obviously the microphone is a smaller piece of kit. So do play it back through. And I think the other thing that has changed with COVID is that a lot more people are happier with the technology of playing backing tracks, etc., using speed shifter maybe to change it if it's a bit fast. You know, I have had many graduation recordings that are under tempo, and I've never sent them back for being under tempo. I just think, oh, that's a bit of a shame. But you know, if you've got a child who's recording Gothic like do 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 do, then that's definitely too slow. It's supposed to be roughly the same tempo as the recording that they listen to each day. But